Hello, Buckeye fans. Welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I'm Patrick Murphy here with you today, and we're going to finally get back to some football. It feels, although it was only 1 week, like it's been almost a month since the Buckeyes last played. The loss to Oregon has sat and in the back of these players' throats and been on everyone's mind now for just over a week and a half. But the Buckeyes take the field again on Saturday afternoon against Nebraska, and we're going to break all that down. We're going to do things a little bit reverse of the way that we've typically done it during the season. I'm going to do some talking about the Buckeyes first, and then in the second half of the show, we will be joined by Brian Chistopherson from 247 Sports Husker247 website. So we can talk a little Cornhuskers, a little Dylan Rayola, a little what the heck happened to Nebraska last week against Indiana, but we'll get to that. First, let's get to the beer. This is the happy hour after all. I am back for the second straight week with the Pumpkin Imperial Pumpkin Ale. As I said last week, this is an 8.6% beer. So last week I took it pretty easy with this one. Today, I don't have as much to do after this show, so I'm going to enjoy it. Still only have one, but we'll see if I drink it as slowly. Actually, I'm not even sure I finished it last week, to be entirely honest with you guys. But pretty good. Enjoyed it. Still have most of a six-pack in the fridge, so seems like a good late October beer to enjoy. So cheers. All right, let's get into it. So I wanted to look at some of the things that we've heard from the Buckeyes over the past week about coming out of the loss to Oregon, heading into the second half of the season, and kind of gauge my expectations on how this will play out and kind of where things will go from here. Because as I wrote a week ago, this is an opportunity for Ohio State. You don't often, if you're the Buckeyes under Ryan Day, get the chance to suffer a loss, which you don't want to do, obviously, but then learn and bounce back from it. And we talked about this a little bit last week. This is that opportunity. You've lost in the regular season. You still have 6 games left. It wasn't like you got blown out. You lost by 1 point to a really good team on the road. So what do you have to clean up? What are they actually going to clean up? What have they said? What will happen as you head into Nebraska this week, Penn State a week from now, and then obviously the rest of the season? So the first thing, obviously, that everyone's talked about over the last week or so is the pass rush. You probably are sick of hearing the numbers at this point, but the Buckeyes, no sacks against Oregon. Although, according to Pro Football Focus, they did pressure Dylan Gabriel on nearly 40% of those dropbacks. So I think there is an idea that Ohio State didn't get pressure. Well, the Buckeyes did get pressure. It just didn't get home, which is part of the problem. You need to get home. You need to figure out ways to do it. And so the talk this week has been about solving that problem. And head coach Ryan Day has talked about it quite a bit in both media availabilities that he's had. And so I want to talk about what I kind of expect from this defensive line. Ryan Day was asked directly, and I was asked about this last week, so I wanted to bring it up, about the disconnect between Jim Knowles and Larry Johnson. And he said he doesn't believe that exists, that they are on the same page. He did say that you can have arguments, you can have discussions when you're in the team meeting room, but when you walk out, you head out to practice, you head out to the game, everybody is on the same page. And he believes that is the case. He's spent more time in the defensive meeting room over the last week and a half, and we have to take Ryan Day at his word for it. Obviously, there have been talks about Jim Knowles and Larry Johnson certainly not seeing eye to eye. I think if you watch Jim Knowles in the past, you can see that they are not doing the same things that his defenses at Oklahoma State would do. Ryan Day was asked about that as well. He said that, at Oklahoma State, he didn't have the talent or the depth on the defensive line, so he had to be more creative. I think some people have shrugged that off as a way for Ryan Day to kind of cover for Larry Johnson. I think that is a pretty honest assessment of what's happened. I've talked in the past about the fact that I think the jack position is kind of overblown at a place like Ohio State, where you can recruit some of the best and you don't need to necessarily have a gimmicky, maybe that's too harsh of a word, but kind of a gadget player out there if you have guys that can do their job. Now, that's if. And why we're talking about this is because it hasn't worked. And Ryan Day admitted as much. He was asked directly about Nick Saban's comments about the defense being a bit antiquated, which I think was a bit harsh on Nick Saban's part. And look, Nick Saban, one of the best head coaches ever, maybe the best head coach ever, certainly a great defensive mind. I'm not going to argue with a guy like that, but he's also not watching Ohio State every play, every down, watching it back. While I do think that there are things that Ohio State certainly needs to do better with the pass rush, and we'll get to that, I think his comments, or at least how they were taken, about Ohio State being antiquated, if you go and watch what he actually said, he talked about the Buckeyes not doing some things that they actually do. There are some other things that they can do that they don't do. But, he talked about simulated pressure. Well, Jim Knowles does a lot of not a lot, but he does simulated pressure. We've seen it where defensive ends drop or defensive tackles drop and linebackers come, things like that. In fact, against Oregon, we saw a very peculiar play where all 4 defensive linemen dropped and only 2 linebackers went. It looked to me like this. We won't go back into it, but it just wasn't executed correctly. So I think some of what Nick Saban has a point of, and that kind of brings us to where I want to go. What will be different when you watch the game on Saturday on TV at the Horseshoe, whatever it may be, against Nebraska? What will be different? And I think it starts with doing some of the more basic things that pass rushes do. Twists, stunts, things like that. Ohio State is going to continue to play a 4 down front. They've got the players to do it. I don't think anyone will argue that the combination of JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, Tyleik Williams, Ty Hamilton, mixing in some of the backup guys, Kenyatta Jackson, Mitchell Melton, Caden Curry, Caden McDonald, all those guys, like, those are talented players. But as Ryan Day talked about this week, they need to be put in a position to succeed. And I think right now they are being told to just kind of go out there. Well, I don't want to put words in my mouth, but it looks like to me they are just going out there and they are straight rushing the passer. There's no scheme to beat the offensive line and get them into the backfield easier. I went back and watched some Chase Young, some Nick Bosa. I think Ohio State was able to get away with doing some of that, though there were more things that they did, it seemed, back then. But Chase Young could just bull rush a guy or speed rush a guy, and he was getting past him and he was getting the quarterback. You didn't need to do a ton of complex scheming to get Chase Young to the quarterback. Same with Nick Bosa, Joey Bosa. For whatever reason, these defensive ends, it's not the same level. They're talented players, don't get me wrong, but there needs to be more things done to create more pressure. And I looked at some of the games Ohio State has played against top 5 teams, because that seems to be the line that everyone is drawing when we're talking about Ryan Day's record. And if I remember correctly, 13 sacks in those previous, I think it was 5 or 6 games against top 5 teams. I believe they had 5 against Georgia in the college football playoff semifinal. So it's not like we're asking Ohio State to do something different. It's coming out of this Oregon game, and it's coming out of last year where there were not enough of the pass rush and getting home that is alarming and concerning. And so I do expect to see some things differently. Do I expect to see wholesale changes across the defensive line? No. Could you see more rotation? Possibly, but I think Nebraska won't necessarily be a good indicator of what it will look like in these matchup games, because they have rotated in other games this season. They didn't rotate much against Oregon. So we may have to wait to see in 2 weeks what the defensive line looks like, what the snap count is against a team like Penn State, and how the Buckeyes change things up. I do think we'll see some differences, though, on Saturday. I don't think if you're Ohio State, you can come out of that game and talk about needing to get more pressure on the quarterback and not have something different have some change-ups ready to go, do some of the things we just talked about. I think it's as simple as that for the defensive line. At least show that you've put some work in on some different concepts. Cheers. And get after Dylan Rayola this weekend. He's another guy who's going to be somewhat elusive. Get after him. Put pressure on that can get home, that at least affects him. Even if you come out of this game with 1 or 2 sacks, you're not lighting it up in that department. You need to feel, I think, that you affected Dylan Rayola in this game. And we just saw Indiana a week ago have success affecting Dylan Rayola. So the ability to do it is there. I don't think it needs to be some sort of complex change. I think it just needs to be a openness to do some things you haven't done. And why they haven't done them, I don't know. These aren't impressive concepts. This isn't innovative ways of thinking with defensive line and rushing the passer. But I don't expect the all of a sudden Ohio State's going to start playing a 3-down lineman system or anything like that. Maybe they will do more of that. Ryan Day kind of hinted at some of that, but I think it's more likely that you see some change ups to what they have, more so than any sort of wholesale changes. Another thing, and this is something I asked Ryan Day about, and it has not come up, but I don't want to spend this whole time talking about the defense. While the offense was very good against Oregon, I felt that they became too pass heavy in the second half of that game. And, the numbers reflect that as well. There were only 12 rushes in the second half, and only 7 of those were for running backs. Now, when I asked Ryan Day about this, he said he liked the balance in the game. He felt that the final drive skewed things a little bit, and he certainly has a point. If you look at the final drive, let me pull up the numbers here real quick. The final drive was 8 plays. Buckeyes went 49 yards. All of those were pass plays. Now, Will Howard was sacked once. He didn't get the ball out, and obviously he ran on the final play. But yes, those numbers certainly affect the final numbers in terms of pass versus rush. But if you look at how things broke down, 6 rushes in the fourth quarter. Now, Ohio State had fewer plays with the way the second half went, but same thing in the third quarter. 6 rushes for 1 yard in the first quarter. And that's after a first half where Travion Henderson broke a couple big runs, looked good. I know Quinshon Judkins had the fumble, but was able to score. So I was a bit disappointed with that. And I felt that, especially with a guy like Chip Kelly coming in, who was supposed to enhance this run game, which I believe he's done. And Ryan Day said it earlier this year, he's a guy who will stick with the run. I felt they reverted back to the Buckeye offense that we have often seen in big games that becomes very pass heavy under Ryan Day. And Ryan Day's not making the play calls, but I just felt like you could have run the ball more. Maybe you take more time off the clock and you don't allow Oregon as much time to drive down the field on their final drive of the game. I just think you can control things a bit more when you have the running game going. And the Buckeyes did in the first half. The majority of their 141 rushing yards came in the first 2 quarters. And then they sort of went away from it. And, again, there are a lot of things that you can point to here. The number of plays, the situations, things like that. But I think that Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins should not be in a close game where you can still run the ball, not be getting 7 carries combined in a second half of football. That just, you're too good at running back, especially in a game where you lose your left tackle. Now, I know they run behind the left side a lot, but Will Howard had to get out of the way a few times after Josh Simmons went out. So that's another aspect. And I think the Buckeyes will lean more on the run in games going forward, especially as we get into cold weather and whatnot. I will be interested to see, again, Penn State. That's going to be the next barometer, right? Nebraska, certainly a test, but I think that that we will learn. The next time we'll really learn a lot about Ohio State is in that Penn State game. So can you be more balanced in that game? The end numbers are fine, 35 pass attempts to 33 rush attempts, but 9 of those went to Will Howard. Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins only had 21 carries combined. And I just think that number in a big game should be higher. I think those are two players that are too good for that to be that low. And then the secondary. I think a lot has been made about the big plays, right? And this is something, by the way, I forgot. First of all, cheers. If you have questions for me, or if you have questions about Nebraska when Brian gets on here, feel free, if you're watching this live, to throw those in the chat. I meant to mention that off the top. Brian can answer some questions on Nebraska much better than I can. So if you're curious about anything with Nebraska, throw those in the chat. I will try and grab those as we go, and especially the ones for him, try and answer those as they come on. I see one here. Larry Break says, don't you think they were trying to protect Zen? Run blocking is more complex. I think there could be an argument made. Ryan Day did not say that. I will have to watch Zen more to see where he is as a pass blocker versus a run blocker. But I think there are opportunities. We saw against Iowa, the first drive against Iowa, Ohio State ran behind the right side of the offensive line quite a bit. Now, Tegra Shabola also got hurt in that game, and when he did come back, he seemed to still be struggling a little bit. Now, Austin Sareveld has played well. So I don't know if it was so much that. I think, you don't want Will Howard to get killed, and Zen did a couple times let his man through or around. So, it's a possibility that was the thinking. But again, I asked Ryan Day. He did not use that as a reason. But thank you for the question, Larry. So to the secondary, the big plays, right? Now, some of this defensive line, I think you can incorporate into the big plays. If the pass rush is getting home a bit more, maybe they don't take some of those shots. But I think there's a couple things that have gone into this. And this is probably the thing that I am, despite the fact that it's become a Jim Knowles problem, it's something that I am less worried about than maybe the pass rush, because we didn't see much of it last year. Now, last year, Jim Knowles was more conservative. We talked about it a lot. He put the shell on the defense. He basically tried to keep everything in front of the Ohio State defense. And they've still done some of that this year, but they've been more aggressive. I expected it to be a bit more balanced, to be entirely honest. I think there were a few things that happened against Oregon. First of all, Oregon had not done a lot of deep shots. In fact, as Chris Hummer, who was on the show last week, talked about, they may not have done any of those. And they have two of the fastest receivers in college football. So should Ohio State have been more prepared for Oregon to do something different? Yes, I absolutely think that that's a fair criticism coming out of that game. But I also think, like, Denzel Burke gives up 2 plays, right? The 69-yard pass to Evan Stewart that set up a touchdown, and then the 48-yard touchdown pass to Tez Johnson. After that, though, second half especially, I thought Denzel Burke looked like Denzel Burke. If you look at the big play breakdown in the second half, there's a 13-yard pass to Stewart from Gabriel. There's a 32-yard pass to Terrence Ferguson when he got free. And I think Denzel Burke may have, if you've seen the numbers of giving up 8 of 8 targets for whatever the yardage was, I think that one may have been attributed to him, but it was really Ferguson, was not his man. He just happened to be the guy closest, so he went and made the tackle. So that's a 32-yard play, and that was a short pass that had some run after it. And then Gabriel to Ferguson again later, but no big plays in the same sense that there was in the first half. So I don't think that is something that Ohio State needs to change a ton. What I do think you need to do is be more prepared for the unexpected in these games. And I think this is going to be especially true in 2 weeks against Penn State. I don't know if you guys have watched much Penn State this year, but especially in the game against USC 2 weeks ago, they were doing some very, very unique formations, unique, just play calls in general. Their new offensive coordinator, who I believe came from Kansas, I like a lot of the stuff he is doing. And some of it is gimmicky. At one point, they lined up with the tight end, Warren, over the ball, and the rest of the offensive line to his right. He snapped the ball, and then they threw to him as an eligible receiver. I believe it ended in a touchdown. Like, they're going to do some unique things. You need to be ready for the unexpected. And Denzel Burke was not. I think if you look at back, especially at that first touchdown, like the Buckeyes are expecting things underneath. I think it was a 3rd and longish, 3rd and 6, 7, something like that. They did not expect that shot over the top. And yes, Oregon hadn't done it before, but you have to know that there's going to be some things that come up that you don't see on film in those games. I see Dan here said they still have Drew Aller at quarterback. Well, this isn't last year Drew Aller this season, and we'll get into Penn State more next week, but he's completing 70% of his passes, 11 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, already has almost 1,500 yards. So this is a different group or a different quarterback in terms of the level of play that he has. So I wouldn't be dismissing Drew Aller, but again, we'll talk more about him there. And then the final thing that I think I'd like to talk about in terms of, things we've heard this week, and how it will look going forward. The missed tackles. It's been an issue with this defense. It was an issue at times against Oregon, maybe not as much as it could have been, given kind of how the Buckeyes have played. I think the linebackers played well enough. I'll pull up the numbers here while I'm talking, but the missed tackles are problematic. And I think if you are going to be Ohio State down the line, playing in the college football playoff and whatnot, that is a concern, I think, for sure. I've got the numbers here. Missed tackles for the game, 11 missed tackles. 3 came from Lathan Ransom, who you probably won't have to worry about this week. Cody Simon had 2, and then Caleb Downs, Arvell Reese, Sonny Styles, JT Tuimalau, Jack Sawyer, and Ty Hamilton all had 1. It's also kind of when the missed tackles happen. There have been times on, a 3rd down or things like that where, like, if you just get the guy down, and look, it's not at an alarming rate at this point. It's not as bad as there have been worse Ohio State teams in terms of missed tackles, but it's just something that, again, these things that have kind of continued to creep up, things that maybe weren't getting fixed before because it wasn't costing Ohio State. Now you have to really hone in on those. Now, Dave Biddle brought this up earlier this week when we were doing the instant reaction on Tuesday. But how do you fix the missed tackle problem? If you don't tackle a ton in practice, which the Buckeyes tend not to, it's hard to solve that issue. Some guys are just better at tackling than others, but I think that is something that they certainly need to hone in on. However, the coaching staff wants to do it. It's a problem. Rick Montoya, turnovers a problem as well. Yeah, absolutely. I think in any big game, turnovers are going to be an issue. Ohio State turns the ball over with the fumble, almost turned the ball over with the interception, the Will Kazmarek one that didn't get called back. And then, that fumble obviously gives Oregon a short field, and you lose the turnover battle because you didn't get any. And that was clearly a topic of conversation throughout the offseason, led by Denzel Burke. But a lot of the guys talked about the fact that they needed more turnovers this season, and they've gotten them, but they seem to have come in bunches, 3 here and 2 there and things like that. as opposed to, actually, I think you have 2 games with 3 of them. So I'm not sure why that is. It's a weird thing, and maybe something to ask the defensive coaches about down the road, because it does seem to be like when they get 1, they get 2 and 3, but if they don't get that first one, they're not getting any, obviously. So why can't you get, if you'd had 1 turnover, imagine in this game, I guess you could pick the drive, but because of how close this game was, but especially at a crucial time, that last drive, that last Oregon drive, and credit to Dylan Gabriel, who did not have his kind of, I don't want to say boneheaded play, but his mistake that leads to a turnover, which has happened, especially in the red zone recently. If you'd gotten that one turnover, that game looks different, right? Even instead of holding Oregon to a field goal, if you'd been able to force a turnover on that drive, you win the game. Now, the last thing I will say before we get Brian on here in a few minutes is, and this is something I'm actually working on a story on it before I started today on the podcast. It'll be out either later today or tomorrow morning. Is this going to be a blessing in disguise for Ohio State? Is this going to be the Virginia Tech game from 2014 where it's a wake-up call? Now, I think that Virginia Tech, that team at the beginning of the Virginia Tech or the 2014 season against Virginia Tech was not nearly as good as this current team, and had more issues that needed to be cleaned up. But can this be a thing that not only motivates the Buckeyes, but also helps, identify these issues more because you actually lost the game? Like if Ohio State, if there's no pass interference call in Jeremiah Smith, offensive pass interference call, and the Buckeyes kick a field goal to win the game, and you get out of Oregon, and there's some things wrong, but you're feeling good. You're probably the number 1 team in the country either last week or this week. Do you hone in as much as the Buckeyes have, or we believe they have this week, to focus on some of those issues? And we'll never know, obviously, but what we will find out is how much they can take and learn from this game, which, as again, I wrote about last week, they haven't had the opportunity to do very often because so many of the losses that have come under Ryan Day, which aren't very many, have come either against Michigan, where you're playing either a bowl game, most likely a bowl game. Only once have they bounced back and gotten to play Georgia, or it's been the end of the season. It's been the Georgia game. It's been the Missouri game last year, things like that. So this is an opportunity, and I think a big one for the Buckeyes to, turn this into a positive. And Will Howard and talked about it. Some other guys talked about it this week, and we'll see. We'll see how they respond. It'll all be about the response and how things go going forward for them. Rick again said special teams is dismal at best. I don't know. I think dismal may have been last season, last couple seasons where there were severe issues with the special teams. Right now, it's just kind of neutral. Like it's not hurting you, but it's also not helping you either. There haven't been many big returns. There haven't been great punts, but you haven't had like multiple blocked. You haven't missed a field goal. I don't believe you haven't missed an extra point. So like it's kind of been a neutral thing for Ohio State so far this season. And, I think I expected it to be better. Rick brought up the onside kick hurt us. Yeah, absolutely. That's a possession won by Oregon. I think, that's something you can point to for sure from that game, but you also have to give Oregon some credit for, having that play ready and executing it. They just drilled it right at Caleb Downs, who did not have the opportunity to do much. He tried to get out of the way. But I don't know if you and Ryan Day was asked about this and didn't necessarily give a great answer, but like, I don't know if you want him trying to catch that. That seems tough. And then getting out of the way. They said that they were ready for something to happen. Clearly they weren't ready for that. Dan asked, what happens to Caleb Downs? He was all over the field at Bama. Here, not so much. I actually strongly disagree with that. And I've been saying that the last few weeks. I think Caleb Downs has been really good. He's not having to make all of the tackles like he did at Alabama, so the stats don't show up maybe as much as they did for the Crimson Tide. But the plays, the ways they are using him are very effective. And I think he, even if he's not statistically making a play, he is, he is having an impact. And I think if you asked anyone on the team, they would say the same thing. And his experience, his leadership has been very important for the Buckeyes as well, which, I know doesn't stop anyone, doesn't show up on the stat sheet, but he certainly has had his impact felt. Again, Ryan Day's talked about it. He was asked about it again today on the radio show. All right, we're going to get Brian in here in just a second. He's going to jump on. So we're going to talk some Nebraska. Again, if you have any questions for Brian about Nebraska, throw those in the chat. If you're watching this live, he is going to be able to answer much more about Nebraska than I would when he gets on here. I realized I did not send him the link, so I had to send that to Brian so he could get on the podcast. Let's see if there's here's a funny one. Can Caleb Downs rush the quarterback? Yeah, probably. They brought him on a couple blitzes this year. Cheers. But that is not what he's primarily out there to do. Rick S says Caleb should have had his body turned sideways before the kick so he could have better avoid the ball. Well, I think the thing is, he didn't know that they were going to drill it at him. They knew that they were going to try something because of the penalty, but what they were going to do, I don't think anyone expected, a rocket off his foot right at a player that works perfectly and bounces perfectly and all that. Anyway, let's get to Nebraska. Let's bring in Brian. Brian, how are we doing?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
I am
you?
Good.
There's not. You're not plural. I'm sorry.
Well, there's people watching. There. Apologies for not sending that link to you. I meant to do that earlier and just forgot, but I'm glad it worked out. Let's get into this. And I think I have to ask you first. I've watched a decent amount of Nebraska this week. I watched last week's game, but you'll have a better answer for this than I would. What the hell happened a week ago against Indiana?
I don't know if I do have a better answer. Everything that could go wrong did. I mean, it's one of those games where you're if you wanted to put lipstick on the pig, it could have maybe been more of a 14 to 21 point game if Nebraska finishes some drives in the red zone. There was one of those kind of critical sequences where the game is teetering on heading to blowout city where it was 28-7 and Nebraska's driving. It's midway through the third quarter. They've used up 7 minutes and then Rayola throws a pick that goes back to the other red zone. And then it was just, it was a route from there. But I just felt like this is a defense that going into the season, a lot of people around here were very hopeful. And they still are top 20, as you know, in some statistics, because they have had some really good games, but they have a lot of veterans, and it's supposed to be a top 10 group. It's supposed to be that kind of unit that is tough to move. And even if something's a little off the path, they don't let it go into the ditch, but they did, man. They didn't force a punt until the fourth quarter in that game. And on offense, they've only scored 7 points in the last 6 quarters, and the passing game has just felt choppy and out of rhythm, and there's all sorts of things that they've got to get ironed out, and obviously this is a tough week to try to do that.
Do you think that the first handful of games are a more fair reflection of this team than a week ago? Obviously Indiana's had a very good season that people didn't see coming, so kind of how do you parcel out obviously there was the loss to Illinois, but that was in overtime. how do you make sense of those two differences?
Yeah, I mean, you do have to factor in that, like, Nebraska played a great game against Colorado very early on in the season. The defense was just on fire in that game. Shedeur Sanders was in a world of hurt. They put pressure on him all night. That is on film. Ohio State has seen that. They've seen that there is that type of capability from Nebraska's on that side of the ball. And, against Rutgers, which of course is not an explosive offense, but a Big Ten team, the defense really carried the day and was put in tough situations. Like there was a case where the Nebraska had a punt blocked and the ball's on the 2-yard line, and there was a penalty down there, and 6 plays, Rutgers couldn't get in from 2 yards out. So Nebraska's defense has some guys, like, especially in the trenches, like Nash Hutmaker and Ty Robinson, that are like 23-year-old men who are tough linemen. And it was just like this last game, they got neutralized. Nebraska was completely on their skates, basically, if it was run or pass. Indiana won every 50-50 ball. Some great back shoulder throws by Rourke, who unfortunately got injured in that game, which dents them a little bit. But I didn't see that type of defensive performance coming. That's what's most shocking to me, Patrick, is this is a unit you expect to be able to sort of figure things out as a game is going on and kind of reroute it to be competitive. And they just weren't, and they tackled the worst I've seen in the Matt Rule era. So I think they have a good culture in that building, and it's tested this week because there's a lot of negativity around here, but they have had an intense week of practice from everything we've heard, and guys are ready to go again. But you wonder if confidence is leaking a little bit, and if Ohio State gets a couple drives early, like, what's that going to look like for a unit that's coming off a week like they had?
Let's talk Dylan Rayola. You mentioned the turnovers against Indiana. Obviously, people who followed Ohio State recruiting are well aware of what he was during the recruitment process, but what has he meant to this program? Coming there after being committed to both Ohio State and Georgia, a legacy in terms of his family and whatnot, and what has he done as a freshman?
I'm sure there's some hard feelings at some places where he's committed to, but it's kind of a storybook thing here. It could be if he grows into the player they think he can become, and I think he has that potential. The thing I'll say about Dylan, who's obviously, his father's name is on the stadium wall here. I mean, that's what it is. And so it does mean a lot that he's wearing that uniform. It sure gave, I think, a boost throughout the off season around here. That he was involved in the program. Like, Nebraska was having a pretty good basketball season, and Dylan Raiola would show up to Pinnacle Bank Arena, sit in the front row, and it would be like as loud as any of the roars from the game, which, they had a good team last year too. So that's sort of what he means. And I think what's been impressive about him, he's coming off one of his tougher weeks, but he came in and he put the 5-star stuff in the rearview mirror, and he knew he had to put his head down and work. He is not shy to go to the veterans for advice on things, and he won respect from guys who are like 5 years older than him. So he's really been humble in that way. I think he has a lot of confidence in his skill set. The place he's at right now is interesting, though. They focus so much because Nebraska was like the worst turnover team in the country last year, and it was such a focal point all offseason. That number has to come down. They've got to change turnover margin, and that can flip some games. And he's done, until last week, really good at that part of it. But I actually thought the game against Indiana was the first time where it felt like he was sort of tentative to me, and maybe just a little slow on some of his throws and didn't attack downfield. And so it might go poorly on Saturday, but honestly, I'd love to see him let it rip a little bit downfield in this game, and what happens. I mean, I'm not saying to be stupid or just haphazard with it, but I would like to see him take some more chances and them try to stretch the field way more than they did against Indiana, because it just didn't feel like it was a threat.
I saw some of his comments this week. I know he had a brief media availability. Do you get the sense that this coming to Ohio State beyond just coming to Ohio State, but the fact that he was committed here so long matters to him?
I think maybe a little bit. I don't think it's the biggest deal. I think there's going to be friendships over there. Obviously, you build on the recruiting trail, and there'll be some good feelings maybe after the game. I don't know what sort of Ohio State's reaction to him. Obviously, Buckeyes are chasing their own big fish and have their own things they're focused on. So it's probably not that, I would guess, not that personal on that side of the fence. And I don't think it's personal on Dylan's side. He just ended up like kind of going where his heart was and where his family name is. And that's ultimately what won out in this process. I think he's excited to play in the Horseshoe and just like, actually compete there. I think he visited there 3 times as a recruit is what he said. And so there were certainly weeks or times in his life when he was envisioning being in that uniform and playing in that stadium, which I view as one of my favorite stadiums to go. I'm not just buttering people up. I love that place. And I think guys love playing there. And so I think whenever you get an opportunity to go compete on a place like that's known top 5 in the country stadium, to me, you have to kind of cherish it and live in that moment a little bit.
Yeah, I will say my experiences when Dylan was a commit to Ohio State, talking to him, always fantastic. I think Ryan Day has handled questions. Not that he's gotten a ton of questions about him. I think because we didn't talk to him last week, so it's been a lot of Oregon questions. But he was asked a couple times about him. He's been very complimentary of him as well. So I don't think there's any bad blood there at all, to your point. And I think it'll be interesting to see him there, given kind of the expectation for a while that this would be where he'd end up. Let's move over to the defensive side of the ball. You sort of touched on earlier about this group. What should Buckeye fans expect, and kind of how do you think the Huskers will deal with this attack that is multidimensional?
Well, it's the second year for defensive coordinator Tony White, who has been very popular with the fan base here. He's had a lot of success. As I mentioned, they were top 10 in a lot of stats by the end of last season. 3-3-5 scheme, but it's very bendable, I guess I would say. They will show a lot of different things. I think Tony was not pleased with what he got done as a coordinator, obviously, in that game, and sort of the positions he put his players in. When this team is rolling on that side of the ball, they really do have tackled well, and they've had 3 or 4 guys sort of swarming. And Indiana did such a good job, or Nebraska did the opposite of, it was a lot of just one-on-one stuff, and you're asking your safety to make a tackle on a talented running back in space. And so if Nebraska's in that position again throughout Saturday, it's going to be a long day. They had only given up 2 runs of greater than 10 yards prior to Indiana. So they were really a salty bunch about not letting the explosives happen. And then the dam just broke. I mean, Indiana, I think, had 9 runs that were greater than 10 yards, and certainly about that many in the pass game. I mean, it just completely ballooned the number that Nebraska done really well at. Nebraska hadn't allowed a rushing touchdown until the Indiana game.
Right.
And the Hoosiers got in there like 4 or 5 times running the ball. So, if they can come out early in this game and do an okay job where they actually put Ohio State in like some 3rd and 4s or 3rd and 5s, and you give yourself a chance to get off the field and you make the play in that moment and you build a little confidence. They are a group that has had success together and played a lot of reps together. I mentioned Ty and Nash. They're kind of the big boys on the D line. John Bullock is a kind of a plucky linebacker who has had a very good first half of the season. Didn't play as well against Indiana, but he's a guy to know. And their secondary is actually pretty veteran. And it sounds like everybody's going to be available too. They thought one of their safeties, Deshaun Singleton, was going to be out, but he's been cleared. The only guy who is out is running back Ramir Johnson. So they have guys who've played tons of football. But the thing I wonder is, can they slow the run game down? Because last week there were some definite things that were exposed, and I'm sure Ohio State has looked those over with a fine-tooth comb and found some things they think they can get done. So that cat and mouse game throughout the week. Can Nebraska find a way to cover up some weaknesses that obviously are out there for everybody on film now?
Yeah, I was talking before you came on. Like, I felt like last week Ohio State didn't stick with, or 2 weeks ago, Ohio State didn't stick with the run as much against Oregon as they could have in the second half. So certainly, I think you could expect them to go with that a little bit more. Not that Will Howard wasn't good; the passing attack was effective, but just to be a bit more balanced. You mentioned that 3-3-5 scheme. Ryan Day got asked about that on his radio show. Can you kind of, maybe in layman's terms, break down what that looks like? Because I think it's interesting, especially right now for Ohio State fans that are frustrated with a pass rush that only rushes 4 most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, 3-3-5 is their base, but Nebraska will switch it up where they'll have 4, sometimes 5 down linemen. They play with the jack linebacker, who they'll stand up, or they'll put his hand in the ground, do a lot of different things, move him around. That will be MJ Sherman, who might be a familiar name to some recruit nicks out there. He played at Georgia on some prior teams, was more a special teams guy there. He's done okay. They've got some okay young pass rushers there. It is an interesting defense because Nebraska really moves it around quite a bit, where I do think it's like one of those things where people want to put a label on it, but they switch how many guys are up front all the time, that it's almost like just label for label's sake,
Right.
I do think it is really bendable that way. But a big part of this, to me, is going to be Ty and Nash on that D line. Those are big boys. They're very good players. They can play at the next level, and they've got to play a great football game and set up other guys. Maybe they won't have a great statistical day Saturday, but when Ty is playing at a really high level, Ty Robinson and Nash Hutmaker, they're sort of caving things in for everybody else. And when this defense is effective, obviously when they're getting teams into like 3rd and 7, they do have a pretty good pass rush. They've really worked hard on their 4-man rush, and getting home with that. And there's a guy they have, James Williams, who that is sort of his specialty, and he's had some big moments that comes off the bench. So they do have some depth on the D line, and all that. Right now, it's hard because they're coming off such a performance where people's heads are just kind of spinning. Like, you've seen this defense play really well against certain teams where you're like, I know there's some capabilities there. So it's within your mind that you could be like, they could go out there and play really well and find some things and make Ohio State really have to sweat a little bit. And then there's just the recency bias that's kind of interrupting everything, where it's like, yeah, but they couldn't, stop anything.
Right.
This past week. So it's just hard to know where their minds are at. You're hoping that this is where your culture and your veteran guys can kind of get back on the horse, sort of like in that NFL mindset. Like, that was last week, you're on to the next one.
Right.
Maybe there's some ways you can attack that you didn't. And they do have guys who have played a lot of football, as I've said. So we'll see if they can use that experience to their advantage of getting over this quick.
Yeah, it is interesting kind of adapting to this NFL mindset, as you put it. Like, obviously, Ohio State coming off this loss, this would be the end of the world sometimes,
right?
But all of a sudden it may not be. You can afford 1 or 2 losses here. Last thing I will ask you, and it sort of goes into what you were touching on there, but just the vibes in Lincoln right now as you lose that game to Indiana the way that you did, and now you have to go to Ohio State, a team that also is coming off a loss. What are people feeling like right now?
I don't want it to come off the wrong way, because every coach at every stop hits that moment when the honeymoon period has ended.
Sure.
It's just going to happen. And then it's like, okay, how did you respond to that? And Rule is such a good spokesman for what they want to do, and he's done a good job. Like, they haven't had a lot of guys leave for the portal or anything like that. That there has been a feeling like, man, they must have a really good culture, and there's guys who came back for a 6th year who really believe in what he's doing. But then something like Saturday happens, and it's an amazing stat. Nebraska's lost 26 straight games against ranked teams.
Wow.
That dates back to 2016. And they haven't been to a bowl game since 2016. That's incredible. I mean, it's
Yeah.
hard to not get to a bowl game in that much time, So here they are. I joked with our guys, like, this is a battle for bowl eligibility this week because that's a big deal in our neck of the woods. And
Yeah.
I know no one in Columbus, Ohio is thinking about that at all. But Nebraska's been at that 5-win mark. They were 5-3 last year, and then they lost throughout November, a bunch of close games, so they didn't get to a bowl. But I would say this is the first week where it's really felt like, okay, whatever skepticism was sort of swirling out in the wind a little bit previously, this is where it's being voiced on like the radio shows and all that stuff. And so we'll see how well they can block out the noise. And again, I don't want that to come off like, they're on the hot seat or anything like that, but it's a deal where this is the most criticism they've faced around here. I think if you had asked me this question a week ago at this time prior to Indiana, it would have been a really positive answer about what they're building. And so you kind of have to go back to that and say, I think that's still there and that foundation is in place, but this is a tough stretch that we're going to see what some guys are made of over there.
Understandable. Well, it should be interesting, I think, Saturday. Looking forward to it. It's not been fun talking about no football and a bad loss over the past 2 weeks. So I'm glad that there will be football again for Ohio State, and I think it should be an interesting game.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Pat.
Yeah, Brian, absolutely. Thank you for the time. We will talk soon, I imagine.
Yep, sounds good.
Right. Thanks. Bye. All right. Thanks again to Brian. Again, they've actually done some really good stuff. I know I say this every week about our 247 sites, but they've done some interesting stories this week that kind of tie into Ohio State. So if you want to read some of those, head over to Huskers247 and check out some of the work they've done. It's been good. I saw one question pop up here, or a comment really, but I wanted to address it. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but Yarish, let me get this right. Yasharel, I believe is correct. LG, apologize for my dog. She has decided to bark at something outside right now. Want to see Denzel Burke redeem himself. I would say if there is one person on this team that I believe won't let some negative moments affect him, it is Denzel Burke. I say this in a positive way. He is one of the most confident players I've been around. And I think, he obviously understands what happened. He got burned twice, and that doesn't happen very often. But if you look at Denzel Burke's freshman season, you look at Denzel Burke's junior season, the 2 seasons he was healthy. Sophomore season, he's talked about the injuries and the mental issues he had with that. But if you look at those 2, he's been one of the best cornerbacks in college football. And I don't think he will let 2 bad plays define him. I don't. Yes, he also gave up a touchdown. I thought it was actually pretty good coverage, and the receiver just won, which happens sometimes. So if you're worried about Denzel Burke, I think I would like to try and calm your concerns or ease your concerns. Well, as my dog starts to yell at people, gonna wrap this up. Thank you for everyone tuning in. Thanks to Brian. I'm excited to get back out there and watch some football and see the Buckeyes hopefully bounce back. I believe that will be the headline on Saturday afternoon, whenever you're going to be reading, is, Ohio State makes a bit of a statement bounce back game against Nebraska. I think Ohio State can roll in this one personally. Haven't done the prediction yet. We'll have that tomorrow, but I don't think this will be particularly close. I think Ohio State can do a lot of the same things Indiana did in Nebraska. And if not, then we'll have another conversation later. But cheers. We'll talk to you guys what we learned after the game with Dave and Steve. Talk to you then.